everyone, it's Nezzle. Welcome back to my channel Nezzle and to another video. Today is not quite a vlog, but I have my dad here with me and he's going to share some of our rich history with you as we celebrate 48 years of independence. So I really hope you're going to enjoy it. He has a lot that he's going to share, and it's a lot of stuff that most of us don't know because it's not really taught. So sit down and maybe get something to eat and enjoy.
Well, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to be part of the celebration of our independence this year. We're celebrating 48 years since we became an independent nation of Great Britain on the 7th of February 1974. I'm thinking though that given the fact that when we went to school, we were not given many opportunities to learn about the history of our beautiful island. So let me use the next few moments just to talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened here in Grenada over the centuries as we move from the point where Columbus, during his third voyage to the Caribbean, sighted Grenada. It was on a Sunday, the 15th of August, 1498. And because that day was celebrated as the Feast of the Assumption of the Virgin, he decided to call this island Concepcion, or Conception Island. Prior to that, it was called Camahorn by the Indigenous colonial people. And then later on, in fact, 2 years later, when Amerigo Vespucci and his map maker Juan de la Costa were creating a map of the New World, they gave this island the name Mayo, M-A-Y-O, a Spanish word which really meant fortunate to have. That name didn't last too long though, because in 1523, Spanish sailors thought that for some reason, this island reminded them of Grenada, which is part of Andalusia in Spain. So they began referring to the island as Grenada. However, when the French invaded the island and took it away from the indigenous colonial people in 1650, they gave it the name La Grenade. And that later changed to Grenada when this island was captured during the 7 Years' War. The British captured it from the French in 1762. So the following year, after it was ceded to Great Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris, they gave it the name Grenada. And since then, that's how we have been known throughout the world. But many things have happened on this island. In fact, after Columbus, quote unquote, discovered it, the indigenous people were left alone for a while. But then it was in 1609 that 208 Londoners, they basically left England with 3 ships, the Diana, Endeavour, and the Penelope. They left on the 1st of April in the year 1609. They arrived here on the 15th of May. Actually, they arrived in St. David, what we now call St. David's Bay, and they attempted to establish the first settlement. And while the ships went off to Trinidad for provisioning purposes, by the time they returned, as the history books say, few had survived to tell the tale of their ordeal. Most of them died because of mosquito-borne diseases like yellow fever, so that particular attempt to settle this island failed. Then there was an attempt in 1638. The governor of St. Kitts de Ponce, he arrived with others pretending to be fishermen who were lost at sea. But they were driven off the island by the very militant and patriotic Kalinago people. However, it was in 1649, going into 1650, that the governor of Martinique was successful in subduing the Kalinago people. They got the chief to believe that they were here as tourists, and eventually they were liquidated in short order Unfortunately, based on the last census, not the current one, the last census, only about 62 people in Grenada could claim to have any kind of Kalinago blood whatsoever. The French West India Company took over in 1674. Then 10 years later, it became a kind of crown colony of France. And if we were to fast forward a bit, we would realize that several things were happening on the island at the time when the French were here. Just to give a few quick bits, like the building of Fort George, because originally the first town on this island was built on a strip of land that separated what we now call the Grenadians lagoon area from the sea. It was on that strip of land that the first town was built, and they called it Port Louis, way back in between 1650 and 1700. The fort, they basically started it in 1705, completed it in 1710, originally called Fort Royal. Later on, it became Fort George after the island became British in 1763. Now, things that were done in that period, for example, the first hospital that was built in Grenada was in 1736, up where we still call Old Fort in St. George's, because 2 years later, what is called Hospital Hill Fort was constructed close to what was the first hospital. They actually renamed that fort years later because of King William of England, so they called it Fort William. Now, if we had to just look for a moment at certain things that were done to boost the economy of this island, we know that in 1702, for example, sugar cane was introduced. Then in 1714, we saw the introduction in a serious way of coffee and cocoa. You know, Grenada has 3 types of cocoa now. The Corelia, we have the Trinitario, and the Foresterio cocoa. And of those 3, we have about 95 varieties. And of those 95 varieties, mark you, 85 are only found here in Grenada. But the point now is that cocoa basically in 1714 was introduced. We had bananas in 1791 for the first time being planted in a big way here in Grenada. And if we're still talking about economic crops, well, nutmegs were officially brought around 1843. A gentleman named Mr. Frank Gurney brought it from the island of Banda, which is one of the 17,000 islands that make up Indonesia. He had gone there on a kind of conference and reportedly brought some seeds back with him, planted them on the Belvedere estate, and as the saying goes, the rest is history. You know, Grenada became the 2nd largest producer and exporter of nutmegs in the entire world. Only Indonesia exported and produced more nutmegs than we did. However, in 2004, Hurricane Ivan uprooted in excess of 82% of the trees, resulting in Grenada plummeting to being number 8 in the world. And sad to say, 17 years later, we're still number 8 in the world, because clearly there is that lack of interest among younger people to get into the production of nutmegs. So just to say that one of the reasons given for so many nutmeg trees falling as a result of the hurricane is because nutmeg has that strange, rare characteristic where as the tree grows, the tap root seems to rot away. So they become very vulnerable for winds over 60 miles per hour. Now, as we celebrate independence, just to bear in mind that when Grenada became a British colony in 1763, it didn't take long for the French, who were never happy that Grenada was in fact captured during the 7 Years' War and that it was ceded to them 1 year later. So in 1779, close to 10,000 Frenchmen. They used over 25 sloops and other ships to invade the island. They did it in what we now call Dragon Bay, where the underwater sculpture park is located. And just to say quickly, that underwater sculpture park has done a lot for Grenada. It was only placed there by an Englishman, Jason de Caires Taylor, back in 2006. And 5 years later, it was doing so well that National Geographic magazine included it in a special edition featuring the 25 wonders of the world. And that has contributed immensely to Grenada's growth as a dive tourism destination here in the Caribbean. So it was on that bay, Dragon Bay, on the 2nd of July, 1779, that the French landed. And they did something that was unexpected by the British. They marched inland, that's the French, they marched inland and then turned around and attacked the British at Hospital Hill Fort and Fort George from the rear. They attacked from behind. Thus, the British capitulated without much of a fight. And that is the main reason why years later we saw the construction of those forts in Richmond Hill. They were started by the French, but because Grenada was given back to the British in 1783 as part of the Treaty of Versailles, it was the British who completed those forts because they realized it made good sense to do those defenses there, having regard for what had happened when the French had invaded them 4 years earlier. In completing those forts, the British recognized the significance. So there were 4 forts and a military hospital. Today, the military hospital has become Her Majesty's prison. At the time, they had called it Fort Cadogan. But in 1800, exactly 100 years after it was completed, the male prisoners that were in what is now the museum in St. George's were relocated to what is now Her Majesty's prison. But the 4 forts, the biggest of the 4, was named after the then governor, Edward Matthew, and up to today we still call it Fort Matthew. 2 were named after sons of King George III of England. His second son, Frederick, that's why we have Fort Frederick, and of course there was Fort Adolphus, named after his 10th son. And because the lands originally had belonged to a former governor, William Lucas, they decided to name one of the forts Fort Lucas, because he cooperated with them more than he had done with the French, who had forcibly acquired his property for building those forts. So after Grenada became British territory again in 1783, we saw a lot of problems arising between the French and the British on island. And it got so bad that by 1795, one of the leading French planters in Grenada, a 48-year-old gentleman named Julien Fedor, was able to lead a rebellion against the British. It included a period of 15 months of fighting from the 3rd of March, 1795 to the 19th of June, 1796. That's when the British finally were able to crush that rebellion. And it took that long because of those forts. The very forts that we spoke about a while ago that were built meant that Fedor and his men had all of Grenada apart from St. George's. And he did that for over 15 months. And part of the Fedor story is what took place on the 8th of April, 1795, when about 48 of the prominent British citizens on this island, Grenada, were literally hacked to death by Fedor and his men. It included the governor and his wife and family. In fact, the only persons that were saved or spared in that massacre were the doctor and his wife and the priest. All the others were killed. And it was a huge embarrassment, really, for the British government at the time. But by the end of it, it was sad to see that over 7,000 slaves died in that uprising. Just after the British successfully crushed that rebellion, a total of 21 Frenchmen in one day were hung in the St. George's Market. And ironically, they never ever captured Julian Fedor. Most plausible of the various stories about his disappearance was that he might have drowned in an effort to get to his brother in Trinidad. But to bring us closer to where we are today, we must mention that, like the other English-speaking Caribbean islands, slavery was abolished in 1838, and then we had efforts to introduce education on the island. There were many challenges because apart from the church wanting to play a role in terms of education, we had a huge reluctance, understandably so as far as I'm concerned, where the former slaves were reluctant to continue to work on the estates where they had operated as slaves. And that is why the British government was eventually forced to acquiesce to constant demands for new labor to be brought to the island. Hence the reason why in 1857 we saw the first shipload of Indian migrants arriving. It was the first of 10 shipments that will eventually bring Indian indentured workers, and they served either 3-year or 5-year contracts. It began in 1857 and more or less came to an end in 1917. And talking about 1857, it's the same year that we saw the commencement of arrivals from Scotland and Ireland. These are people who were being released from prison, and rather than keeping them in the UK or Scotland or Ireland, they were more or less banished to Grenada, and they created their own special village or hamlet, what we today call Mount Morris. All of the people up there originally were descendants of Scottish and Irish prisoners who were given land settlements by the British government, and they began living very productive lives, admittedly. They became businessmen, they got into trucking business, fishing, agriculture, etc. So the arrival of the Indians was significant. A lot of them ultimately migrated to Trinidad and Guyana. Some went back to India. Those who remained in Grenada after completing their contract and had enough money to buy land were able to do so. In fact, the government was very kind to them. Those who were here for 3 years were able to purchase land paying just £1 per acre. It meant that with £10, you could have purchased 10 acres of land. And if you had done 5 years, you got what was called a bounty arrangement. 2 acres for £1. And maybe even today we look around and we see some of the estates that are operational are still owned by descendants of folks who came from India. If we had to get closer to independence though, we can't help but mention what happened when Sir Eric Matthew Gary, or Eric Gary at the time, returned to Grenada from Aruba, where he was working in the oil fields. And his arrival, in fact, he got here in 1949. And by 1951, he was the most popular gentleman on the island. And strangely, a lot of us may not even realize that it was only in 1951 that Grenadians, all Grenadians, got the opportunity to start voting in general elections. Today we take it for granted, but there was a huge struggle towards that end. In fact, initially, adult suffrage, universal adult suffrage, was only made available to people 21 years and older. Later, it was dropped to 18 years and over, as it is today. Now, I didn't mention that we did become a crown colony in 1877, and when I say a crown colony, that is of Great Britain. So they were responsible for everything to do with the governance of Grenada, both internal and external matters. So for example, in the year 1906, it was in the British Parliament that legislation was passed declaring the Grenadian Forest Reserve. A total of 3,716 acres of land were made into a forest reserve, protected forever. And the reasoning behind it had to do with the wild animals, the Mona monkey. In those days, they had the agouti, you had the armadillo, the 9-band armadillo, what we call the manikou, or the opossum. Those animals had to be protected. But more importantly, having a properly managed rainforest was hugely significant to guarantee a level of rainfall throughout the year. So that was in 1906, and it was the British government who took that decision on behalf of all of us here in Grenada. And if we are to just bear in mind as well that coming out of the introduction of adult suffrage in 1951, we saw changes in the constitutional arrangements between Grenada and the UK. In 1967, we became a kind of unitary state of Great Britain, where we were responsible for our internal matters, but the British government was still responsible for anything to do with our activities on the world market. Of course, that changed later on because Gary was determined to bring Grenada to independence. So he was told that once it is clear that he is getting the support of the Grenadian people, then the British government will seriously consider granting independence to this island. Gary suggested that once he campaigned in the 1972 general elections, using independence as one of the main pillars of his campaign, it could have been interpreted as a kind of referendum in that regard. Of course, the British government agreed with that reasoning, and there were different conferences, in October 1973. They met in England, and there were other serious discussions like the conference in Marlborough. And so the bottom line is that the British government agreed, notwithstanding the rising opposition in Grenada, to the point where there was a committee of 22 who were arguing that while they did not disagree with the significance of becoming an independent nation, it was their opinion that it was not a good idea to have it under Gary. But Gary persevered in that regard, and in spite of a national strike in Grenada at the time, in total darkness, we saw the island becoming independent with the lowering of the Union Jack, that's the British flag, and the lifting of our own flag, a flag that was designed by Anthony George, a flag that mirrored our burning aspiration to be free, according to Gary. That's what the red borderline means. And then the green speaks of our dependence on agriculture and our lush vegetation, while the gold or yellow speaks of our hospitality, our friendliness as a tourist destination. The flag also has an indication of our spice character, the nutmeg is on the flag, and the stars represent the 6 parishes and, of course, Carriacou. So there are 7 stars on the flag. So, all in all, independence happened, and eventually there was the end of the strike, and we started to build from there. And most of us know what happened in 1979 with the government being overthrown because they had won the 1976 elections. They won 9 seats and the opposition alliance 6 seats. But there are various stories, various explanations as to why it was necessary for the revolution, but maybe that's something that can be spoken of another time. At the present time, it's just to wish everybody happy independence, to recognize that this island has a very, very colorful history. It would take hours, literally, to talk about it. I didn't speak, for example, of the cholera epidemic of 1854, which was very hard on Grenada. Almost 4,000 Grenadians died because of cholera. And I'm talking about 4,000 being big, but just next door in Barbados, more than 20,000 people died from that same disease. In Jamaica, it was in excess of 30,000. We had riots on this island, like in 1925. We had lots of attempts during slavery, uprisings, etc., etc. But given the limited time today, just want to thank you. Hope I didn't bore you too much, but our history is rich and colorful. And we need to hope and pray that they will start to teach it in our schools, because most of what I just told you, I didn't know when I left school. God bless you.
So guys, I really hope you enjoyed listening to my daddy share about our beautiful island of Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique. So if you did, definitely thumbs it up. Leave a comment, let him know what you thought of it. Let him know what you learned. If there was something in there that you didn't know before, then let us know in the comment section. I'll be checking, and Daddy, make sure you check. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed, then subscribe, because he has a lot of information to share, and there are lots of other fun stuff on this channel, so there's a lot for you to benefit from. So subscribe, hit the bell so you'll be notified every time I post, and of course, have a very, very happy Independence Day. Thanks for watching. Bye.